Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. This is February the 19th. This is a Tuesday. And we're going to go back to reading from the book of The Amazing World of Kreskin. We finished up chapter 10, The Amazing World of Kreskin. And so we're going to start from reading on chapter 11. My reasoning factors often become my enemies. If I begin to evaluate a situation critically, apply logic, and reason to it, I find I'm in danger of destroying what information I've received from my subject or my guides. The information or image must come impulsively and spontaneously. It must be accepted in that manner and not examined. In Indianapolis, I was trying to find an object hidden somewhere within a 25-story building. My guides, Governor Edgar D. Whitcomb, and two high city officials were by my side constantly, thinking only of where they'd hidden the paper decal. To avoid suspicion, I request more than one guide, hoping for 3 or 4 well-known people. Thus, a telepathy committee is usually formed. For 35 minutes in this case, I was completely stymied. I was almost on the verge of nervous exhaustion, ready to quit. It was all the more embarrassing since United Press International and a local TV crew were covering the test. I kept saying to Governor Whitcomb committee, for God's sakes, tell me mentally what floor it's on. The signals I was getting were ridiculous, or so I thought. I got off the elevator on floor after floor, nothing on the 3rd, nothing on the 4th, 0 on the 8th. Finally, we reached the 24th floor, then the 25th. I was soaked with perspiration. Then I realized what had happened. Once again, through trying to reason, I'd become my own archemy. I had set up a mental barrier which made it impossible for me to perceive their thoughts. I had kept saying to them, insisting, think of what floor it is on. I'd become more angry with each moment. Maybe it wasn't on any floor. I raced back into the elevator, and there was the paper decal cleverly hidden behind the inspection sign on the elevator wall. For another similar test in the same city, a sheriff handed me a cigarette lighter. I was to locate the owner of the 600,000 inhabitants within city limits. Climbing into a limousine, I began the search while the sheriff concentrated on the location of the owner. I was permitted to talk to the driver, directing him from thoughts received from the law officer. At one point, I stopped the car and got out, the sheriff and the TV crew following. Receiving distant, positive information, I walked about a mile, finally turning into a bank. When I approached an elderly teller, he gave me such a blank, almost hostile look that my reasoning told me I was wrong. Positive now that the owner of the lighter was in the bank, I studied other employees, even customers. but was drawn back into the teller each time as the sheriff, whom I had not seen, kept mentally insisting that I'd found the right man. It was the simple hot and cold of the childhood game, Hucklebuck Beanstalk. Finally, I went up. Sir, I said, either this is yours or I've blown the test. It seemed an eternity until the teller broke into a smile. It's mine. To locate him had taken 48 minutes, at least 20 minutes, including the 1-mile walk. Could have been cut had I accepted without question or reasoning the sheriff's explicit directions to the bank and his unequivocal vocal mental commands toward the hostile-looking teller. As part of each concert, to combat skepticism and the accusation that my subjects are paid Confederates, I request that my paycheck be hidden. I made the claim that I'd find it or the sponsors will have the benefit of a free performance. So I do have an incentive to find it. To date, among other odd places, my check has been stuffed into a turkey at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, nestled in a cuisine frozen in an ice tray, taped to a board ripped up from the stage and replaced, tucked beneath a man's upper plate in an audience or 8,000 at Northwestern University. The hiding and guiding committees resort to deviousness beyond belief. College students can think of hiding places that would defeat the FBI. They defy all logic and produce migraines. I asked for it, but it is, after all, hard-earned money, and I prefer to find it. Once in a Methodist church in Cadwell, I suddenly stopped in an aisle and blurted out, "Gun?" seemingly to be drawn toward a man sitting a few spaces over in one pew. I requested that he take off his coat and then saw the gun in a shoulder holster. He was a plainclothes detective, I later learned. The check was in an empty bullet chamber, rolled to a pencil size. Private parties, which I do occasionally, often give birth to particularly elaborate hiding schemes. The hosts have weeks to think about selecting the fee. At one in Regalsville, Pennsylvania, I kept going back into the library and pulling out an expensive leather-bound book, thumbing through it and pulling it back. The check was in that specific book, according to the mental message I was getting from my hostess. Finally, I understood that she wanted me to rip the binding of the book as act completely against my nature. However, I obeyed the thought and out-peeked the check. She'd gone to the trouble of having a shoemaker open the binding, insert the check, and then carefully restitch the spine. Depending on the situation, size, and nature of the group and the length of the performance, I occasionally challenge the committee to provide a thought perception action test, any sequence of 3 or 4 physical actions prior to the hidden check routine. Logically, the test will key the finding of the check. Wolf Messing has been using similar action sequences for some years. In one such test, I remember a sudden urge to remove a pack of cards from the stage table. I fumbled through them, following the mental directions. I found myself holding the ace of spades and dropping the balance of the deck to the floor. I awaited the next signal and tore the ace of spades in half. It did not seem sufficient, so I tore each piece again. I was as mystified as the audience when a third signal told me to toss one of the pieces in front of me. Turn, toss another, turn again, toss another, a final turn, and toss. The committee chairman then stepped up to inform me I was ready to proceed with the check finding. I'd passed the test of tossing the four corners of the ace of spades, north, east, south, and west. My check would be in a westerly direction. ESP action tests tend to be difficult simply because of the almost endless possibilities within any given room or group of people. I can't recall that any two tests have been of the same nature. David McCallum, the Scottish actor of one of the states of TV Man from U.N.C.L.E., went backstage on my TV show to prepare such a test. Assisted by 3 audience members, he wrote out 3 action steps and placed them in a separate envelope, returning to the stage area. One committee member began concentrating on the first test. Soon I found myself waking up to different men in the audience in response to the concentration. It took me a moment to realize that the signal had something to do with the ties. There was a negative whenever I stopped in front of a tieless man, or there was no signal. Finally, I understood that I was to take a tie off. I accomplished that and waited. McCallum then opened the other 2 envelopes and began to concentrate. I found myself moving along the front row and then stopped by a woman. It did not make sense. The tests are seldom very logical, but I laced the tie around her ankle and secured it. My final direction seemed to be a request to bring the lady to the stage. I complied. The 3 actions matched the committee's slips of paper. More than any other ESP experiment, the action test indicated the need to carry out the perceived thought without evaluation. This is particularly true in seeking the location of the performance feed. People sometimes ask, when you come into the auditorium to find the check, what is going on inside you? On the conscious level, do you try to do anything you can analyze and explain later? Does a picture of the hiding place flash through your mind? What really happens? This advanced form of huckle-buckle beanstalk requires, once again, that I detach myself from the immediate environment, concentrating only on the thoughts and directions of my guides, who are also the hiders. I even lose them as people, not aware if they are male or female. I concentrate on reading every direction, every clue, and sensitize myself to hear or see any supportive factors beyond the perceived thought. In this experiment, I found the guide is desperately trying to penetrate. It can be likened to a highly stimulated game of charades, when the leader is particularly standing on his ear to get his point across. It is much easier for me when 1 or 2 guides function as in the McCallum test. A whole committee tends to fill the communication with confusion. So far, in thousands of attempts, I've only failed once. During an early evening performance in the East, I had about 20 people sitting in a semicircle facing the audience. I was beginning a demonstration in suggestibility. My glasses were off, and I was bending over a woman standing behind her, talking to the audience. She raised her arm to fix her hair and accidentally hit my hand, jabbing the stem of my glasses into my left eye. I thought the blindness was momentarily until someone yelled, "Blood," was streaming down my cheek. After the performance was canceled, the doctor's quick examination revealed no permanent damage. It would heal within a week or so. I went on to New York that night because I had an engagement at a all-night private Park Avenue party. I managed to fumble through the ESP and suggestibility phases and began to search for my check at about 5 a.m. But soon forfeited it. The eye was throbbing. I was now loaded with painkillers and couldn't concentrate. A reporter once said, "That's an amazing, exciting game, isn't it? Playing hide and go seek with your own money." All I could think of was, yes. Chapter 12. I suppose that anyone who calls himself a mentalist invites participation in strange affairs. Occasionally, wherever I am, the phone will ring, and I find myself involved in a matter completely unrelated to show business. Some are interesting, others I prefer to duck. There are also those in which I can be of no help. A few times I've been requested to assist in locating missing persons by thought perception. As much as I'd like to help, I have to decline. I don't think it is possible unless the person who is lost is sending a call for help and is also wise enough. Hey, hey. Good morning, good morning.
Good morning, Robert. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing really good. And yourself?
Good. Pretty good. Had to put down my puppy yesterday, so
Aw.
so sad.
Yeah, I hate to hear that.
Yeah, it just happened suddenly. He was at the doctor 10 days ago and got a glowing report. They he got a hold of something and started throwing up and wouldn't eat. And
Oh, wow.
deteriorated. Pretty sad.
Well, I understand Reverend Dave's been moved up to the third or fourth floor somewhere.
I just saw that. It sounds like he's going to the care place.
Yeah, the rehab.
Yeah. So that's a good
And,
thing.
and I guess he's going to be there for 6 to 12 weeks.
Oh, golly. Not good.
No, but apparently the surgery went well. So,
Yeah.
that's
him a while
good.
to recover. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, he really did a job on himself, it sounds like. Holy cow. It's going to take him a long time.
Oh, yeah, but we'll keep praying for him, and he will endure and get well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm back to reading The Amazing World of Kreskin.
Okay.
I'm on chapter 12, moving right along, so to speak. And it's very, very interesting about some of the things he did. He was talking about how some of the things that he would do is he would have people decide how much they're going to pay him for his performance.
Mm.
And then write out a check for that amount. Then they would hide it. And if he couldn't find it, then he
Didn't get it.
He wouldn't get his check.
Oh, that's good.
And the last sentence that I had read said that he only failed at that once, and
Huh.
that's because somebody accidentally lifted up their arm and hit his glasses, and glasses hit his
Oh,
eye, and his eye
dear.
started bleeding, and there was a lot of pain, and he
Oh,
couldn't
gosh.
concentrate. So he had to forfeit that particular check.
Oh, gosh.
But only failing once,
Pretty good.
that's not bad. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and start on chapter 12. I
Okay.
just finished up on chapter 11. Anyway, I suppose that anyone who calls himself a mentalist invites participation in strange affairs. Occasionally, wherever I am, the phone will ring and I find myself involved in a matter of completely unrelated things to the show business. Some are interesting, others I prefer to duck. There are also those in which I can be of no help. A few times I've been requested to assist in locating missing persons by thought perception. As much I'd like to help, I have to decline. I don't think it is possible unless the person who is lost is sending a call for help and is also wise enough to pinpoint the location and have a sensitive receiving tuning in. A perceptive parent would be more likely to receive such information by telepathy than any expert. The idea of psychic locating a lost child in the wilderness is fine for fiction, but mostly pathetic in a real situation.
Hmm.
However, there are mental techniques which can work in other cases. Shortly after the Sharon Tate murders in 1969 in California's explosive Bel Air section, the infamous Charles Manson family case, I received a phone call from Robert Holton, chief of detectives of the Los Angeles Police Department, in the hours immediately following the grisly deaths. It appeared that some type of cult might have been involved. At least the flames looked to be ritualistic, so the police had begun probing into all cult possibilities,
Hmm.
hoping to develop leads. One logical avenue was to ask the aid of occultists. Several psychics and mediums talked to Houghton and gave him certain judgments. I explained that I was not a psychic, but would be willing to listen and talk and make any contribution I could. Houghton told me what the Hollywood psychics had said. It was pretty flimsy and speculative, in my opinion. Later, their reasoning from the occult point of view was proven completely wrong.
Hmm.
Then, as now, my only possible contribution would have been to work with a witness, someone who had actually seen the crime take place but could not recall certain details due to trauma, or someone who had been the participant leaving the scene but could not describe the person or the automobile because of the trauma. My role would have been to attempt to draw out information or clarify it, using modifications of the same techniques I use on stage. In fact, major law enforcement agencies could well use at least one expert interrogator trained in the techniques to stimulate recall. It might save time and money and possibly contribute to justice. As a minor example, while appearing in Dallas, I received a request from a friend, a lawyer, with a wealthy but slightly eccentric and bothersome lady client whose household staff, the butler and the maid, was under suspicion of jewelry theft. Two very inexpensive earrings and a bracelet were missing, but had not been reported to the police because of a tax situation.
Hmm.
I pointed out that I couldn't work with anyone unless he cooperated, and that if the butler or the maid was guilty, they wouldn't lend themselves to incrimination. I might detect a lie if I could talk to them, but preferred not to because I could be wrong. However, I agreed to visit the client. We went back over the night, a very muddled period during which the jewelry had disappeared. The lady had been drinking heavily at a party. She finally remembered taking off the earrings and bracelet after coming home. Piecing together every more move that she could recall, we finally located the jewelry behind a vanity in her dressing room.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
I think she wanted to blame her staff instead of too many Scots and sodas. Another case involved personal injury. An insurance company was refusing to pay a claim after an accident near Montclair, New Jersey, maintaining driver negligence. The lady was not able to recall exactly what had happened before her car went off out of control. We had 3 or 4 sessions to work back to the moment of the crash. Finally, pinning down a pile of wet leaves on a curve as the point of loss of control. In previous testimony, she had not mentioned the leaves, and other skid marks had confused the path of the car on the slick surface. Perhaps the most interesting consultation came out of an FBI request after a bank robbery in Passaic, New Jersey. A witness had been in front of the bank during the getaway. She had seen the robbers, the car, and probably the license plate, but could give no description. Naturally, she'd been terrified at the time. The FBI brought her to my office. After talking to her for a few minutes, I turned off most of the lights. I had her gaze at the darkened wall and then asked her to picture some simple objects. As she relaxed and began to accept the fact that she might be able to recall much more of the scene, I had her reconstruct the getaway moments. Soon she began to add movement and sound to her descriptions, which she had failed to do under her previous taped questioning. At that point, I felt that her imagination had been triggered. She then added a few other details and was finally able to see the car and describe it, but not the license plate. You've been to comedian movies where the film is backed up, haven't you? I remember saying, everything comes forward to you on the screen. Yes, she said. Okay, keep looking at the wall and back that car up. When it came close enough in her mental recreation of the scene, she did read off the license plate number very precisely, and it had assisted the FBI in breaking the case. There was no psychic phenomenon swirling here. The trauma of that afternoon had blocked her unconsciousness, and she had temporarily rejected both the car and the license plate. All she needed was a guide back to the circumstances. And I've heard of that being done more than once.
Mm.
All right, chapter 13. And I'll take a strong belief in ESP appears to be a major factor in its everyday use. The non-believer is likely to shrug off even a decisive feeling He simply cannot accept the idea that he has received a compelling mental direction. At 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, November 12th, 1972, one very strong believer, Mrs. Lechka Shindu of Scottsdale, Arizona, was suddenly struck with the possibility that an alien friend, Jim Grover, who lived 60 miles away, was in trouble. He did not have a phone. I had a premonition, she said later. I had vibrations around myself. I think in my mind that Mr. Grover needs help. A few minutes later, she told her 16-year-old son, George, of the premonition. That's funny, he replied. I just had the same feeling about Mr. Grover. The 58-year-old bachelor lived in a desolate area near Florence, site of the Arizona State Prison. Responding to premonition, not questioning it, Mrs. Cinco and George, accompanied by his 17-year-old friend, drove to Governor's small house, reaching it just before 6 o'clock. They found that the front door was locked, a measure seldom taken by Grover. Few people ever came near the house. Using an emergency key that Grover had given her, Mrs. Cinco opened the door and they went in casually. Seconds later, a tall man holding a gun stepped into the front room. What's happened to Mr. Grover? Mrs. Cinco asked. Nothing, lady, nothing, the man answered. But Mrs. Cinco's premonition had been false. When she looked into the kitchen, she saw the ill-fatigued governor sitting in a chair, held captive by another man, later identified as Charles Schmidt, the infamous Piper of Tucson. Pied Piper of Tucson. Both men were convicted murderers and had escaped the previous day from the nearby state prison. Shipman had brutally killed 3 children, and Raymond Hutchins had been convicted of killing his estranged wife and her parents. A massive manhunt stretching into California was underway. Offering herself and the boys as additional hostages, Mrs. Cinco agreed to drive the killers to Tempe, Arizona, where they were finally captured. None of the hostages were harmed. There is little doubt that the mental communication was established that day between Grover, also a strong believer in ESP, and Mrs. Cinco. He was sending a call for help. It is quite likely that hundreds, if not thousands, of communications similar to those established between Mrs. Cinco and Governor take place daily. Few ever involve escape killers and consequently are not reported. Those involving death, accidental or natural, are seldom revealed unless the key persons are prominent or the circumstances unusual. But scientific evidence of two-way telepathic communication is mounting as researchers bank experiments related by the general public. It does not appear to be as common as the spontaneous one-way flashes, but there is indication that it could be developed particularly among close friends or loved ones. Roland Smith, now a CBS TV news commentator in New York, told me of a dangerous flight that he made in Vietnam during a time when his wife, back in Indiana, was expecting a baby. On takeoff, he had discovered that the military plane was loaded with ammunition. They were flying over an area held by the Viet Cong, known to be heavily fortified with anti-aircraft and guns and rockets. Smith said he'd never before prayed so hard. Suddenly he had a vision of his wife giving birth and asked his cameraman to note the time. A week later, arriving safely back in Indianapolis, he started to tell his wife of the vision. But she interrupted to say that she had seen him in an aircraft, experiencing great fear.
Mm.
At about the same moment, the baby was born. A check revealed that the times coincided almost to the minute recorded by the hospital as the time of birth. Several summers ago, I awakened from a troubled night's sleep to face a day which included a flight. I was booked to open that evening in a hotel at Lake Placid, New York. I blamed the restless night on high heat and also blamed heat for my negative mood. I couldn't get myself together. I wanted time, delayed packing, and finally had to apologize to my family for being prudish. Prudish? Churlish?
Churlish.
Childish.
Churlish.
Hmm.
Just means disagreeable.
Oh, okay. I was terribly depressed, but didn't know why, aside from the humidity. Going to the airport, I detoured through Newark instead of my usual fast route via the Garden State Parkway. I had no reason to do it and soon found myself tied up in city traffic. What should have been a quick, easy freeway trip to New York Airport and turned into a stop and go. By the time I cleared the midtown clutter, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Flight time, and I broke speed limits all the way to the parking lot. Checking in, nervous, shot, soaked to the skin, I was told by the girl at the desk to run for it. But by the time I got to the gate, the aircraft door was closed and the plane was beginning to taxi. I walked back to the desk, and the same girl arranged for me to take a helicopter to LaGuardia and then catch another plane. I inquired about my luggage. It didn't seem to be around. The girl answered vaguely, "Oh yes," but appeared to do nothing. I blamed it on the 90-degree heat. She already tagged it, wherever it was, and I assumed it had gone on to Lake Placid. When I landed at Lake Placid after a rough flight from LaGuardia, I suddenly became obsessed with my missing luggage. I watched as the old-fashioned cart emptied the aircraft, but I couldn't spot my bags. The small Lake Placid airport promised to check with the Newark and send out a tracer. In the afternoon, I shopped in the village for a dark suit, shirt and tie, hopeful that by morning the aircraft would find the missing bags. 20 minutes before I went on stage that night, the airline called to inform me that my bags had been shifted in Albany to the original flight from Newark. When would they arrive? My annoyance ceased when the voice informed me that the original flight had canceled en route to Lake Placid in a cow pasture. I hadn't been listening to the radio. In trying to analyze this as a premonition, I went back to the sleepless night, to the depressed mood, to procrastination in parking, to taking a detour that had never been taken before, to missing the plane by less than 60 seconds, finally to look of complete detachment on the face of the girl at the airline desk, or I read it that way. Perhaps they were all signposts with the Newark detour at the crucial indicator. From such incidences and many others that are in my files, I'm convinced that the unconscious mind is as sensitive and on some occasions more sensitive than the conscious mind. In telepathic situation, it obviously has a longer range than apparent incidences of precognition. It often defies any current understanding. I'm also fully convinced that if we all sensitized our minds, developed the natural powers that are there, we could avoid many hazards. There is every reason to believe that we do have a radar system that we seldom turn on. Any precognition seems to be a definite part of ESP. About 1850, Mark Twain dreamed of seeing his brother Henry lying in a metal coffin, dressed in one of Twain's own suits, holding a bouquet of flowers in his hand. The center flower was a red rose. The coffin rested between two chairs. 2 days after this dream, a boat exploded on the Mississippi and Harry Clemens was killed. Hurrying home, Twain found his brother lying in a metal casket, dressed in a suit he owed, clasping a bouquet of flowers. The center flower was a red rose. Had Twain arrived a few minutes later, the coffin would have been placed between two chairs. They had already been drawn up. Similar incidences may have happened to any number of John Does, but would never have reached the public print. Harry Keller, like most magicians, was a die-hard skeptic where psychic phenomena were concerned. Yet when he came face to face with premonition, he was as vulnerable as any non-professional. Staying overnight with a friend, he awoke to find the man depressed and troubled. Over breakfast, the friend confided that he'd had a dream. He'd seen a devastating train wreck. Many people had been killed. Keller was scheduled to depart that afternoon by rail. The magician thought about it for a while and then submitted to the dream precognition. He postponed his trip for 24 hours. Luckily that he did. The friend's dream came true that evening. There is a definite indication that people are capable of receiving telepathic messages while sleeping, possibly even while dreaming. Occupied with the dream, the mind may not be too receptive to outside interruptions, but it is another of the unknowns, and a strong signal could possibly break through the dream. Being physical as well as psycho, the brain does appear to rest, but it is doubtful that it is totally asleep. It remains partially active, receptive to messages from within a room or house, an unusual noise, a baby's cry, a cracking door, thunder, or on occasion, perhaps, messages from a distant, long or short. Arthur Godfrey tells of an incident that occurred when he was in the Coast Guard. One night at sea, he thought he awakened and saw his father floating away from him. Or perhaps, he said, within the distortion of his mind, he was still asleep. He thought, however, that his eyes were open at the time he had the vision. That, too, is possible. we can dream with our eyes open. In the morning, Godfrey received the message that his father had passed away. He radioed back and requested the exact time of his father's death. He matched it within a few minutes. The time that Godfrey had noted as the apparent wake-up time. A few years ago, a reporter for the Newark Star-Ledger related a somewhat similar case that took place in Elizabeth, New Jersey. A wire story had been filed from Europe with the scant detail that a young serviceman taking a flight from Germany to surprise his parents had been killed when the plane crashed on takeoff. Thinking that the Army had already notified next of kin, the reporter went to the house and found the mother in hysterics. She said, "You don't need to tell me." She awakened a few hours earlier and had seen her son in flames. The Army did not get around to the notification until the next day. I bet this has happened to many of us.
Yeah.
Reported daily, weekly, such incidents are common and add solid foundation to the need for extensive research in sleep and dream telepathy. Excuse me. Such studies has recently been carried out at the, I can't pronounce that one, Medical Center Dream Laboratory in Brooklyn, New York. Under the direction of Dr. Stanley Krepner, it was long overdue, has provided much added knowledge to the simple human experience of dreaming. Visually, as well as with sensors, Dr. Krepler has observed sleeping subjects while they were in the dream state. By attaching the electroencephalograph, EEG, and other sensitive instruments, Kepler has been able to study nervous activity, including the REM factor, rapid eye movement, which is the first indication of the dream state. The eyes move and react normally even though the subject is asleep. If the imagination sends a car toward the dreaming subject, the pupils will expand, they will contract. If an object recedes into the distance, if the subject is dreaming with eyes open, bright light will cause the iris to close. Dim light will open it. In telepathic experiments, Krepler found that sometimes he could have an awake sender sitting nearby the sleeping subject, establish communication. He would hand the sender an envelope which contained an emotionally dynamic topic, usually a newsprint photo. As an example, I remember that they used one from the John Kennedy funeral. The sender then concentrated on the scene, attempting to project his thoughts. The mind picture to the hopefully receptive sleeper. When the dream state began, the message was continued. After a while, the subject was awakened and asked to describe the dream. In some cases, particularly when a message as dramatic as the Kennedy funeral was used, the subjects incorporated the picture into the dream or dreams, and the only possible source was the sender sitting nearby. One significance of Dr. Krepler's exceptional work is indication that our minds have the capacity of receiving information and temporarily storing it while the body is in dormant. In attempting to sort it all out, it is difficult to distinguish the shadings of differences between telepathy, precognition, and even clairvoyance. With the subject awake or asleep, they all seem to be under the same general dome, but there is overlapping which compounds the simple truth that the entire phenomenon is basically unexplained. This leads to wide distrust, if not disbelief, in all the manifestations. However, for every notable skeptic, past and present, there have been notable believers. Mark Twain coined the term mental telepathy when his letters crossed letters from friends in which they discussed topics he'd already covered in his non other than Albert Einstein wrote the introduction for the German edition of a utopian Sinclair mental radio. The subject was telepathy. The next Conservative American Association for the Advancement of Science did not welcome ESP until 1971, when it finally accepted the subject as a legitimate area for scientific research. But its approval, primarily engineered by the anthropologist Dr. Margaret Mead, was a major breakthrough. Those involved in serious research were at last encouraged and awarded some respect. And in a measure, Dr. Rhine scoffed at it for a quarter of a century, was finally been vindicated. And that's where we're going to stop. We'll start next time on chapter 14. Very interesting. Which is cool because, I mean, a lot of what's written here I've always believed anyway. You know. And they do suggest all the time that so much of this is, it's just not, you can't prove it. You can speculate because certain things do happen, but you can't nail it down and say, well, this is this and that is that. Yeah. I have to apologize. My sinus just drives me nuts.
Oh, I thought maybe you had a cold. Everybody's got the flu here.
Oh, no.
Yeah, in this area.
Yeah, it's just sinus. I've had it all my life, and there ain't nothing I can do with it but live with it. But I'm just going to real quick, so I can stop the tape, say I want to thank everybody that showed up. I hope everybody's enjoying my readings. And we'll see you again on Thursday, the 21st. So, recording